Hi everyone. In this video, we'll be doing a lab walkthrough on AWS resource policies. Take a look at the related article for this video at cloudsecuritymasterclass.com. An AWS resource policy is similar to an IAM policy or an identity-based policy. But instead of being attached to an identity, the resource policy, as the name suggests, is applied to a resource. In this video, we will create a S3 bucket resource policy. Compare that policy with an equivalent IAM policy and see how easy it is to publicly expose a S3 object. So let's go to the S3 console and create our very first S3 resource policy. I have a bucket already existing in this account. So I'm going to go inside it and we'll see that we have an object here. So imagine a scenario where we have to create permissions to give access to this particular object from an IAM user. Let's see how we can do that with the bucket policy. So I'm going to go back to my buckets, click on my bucket, go to permissions here, and you see the bucket policy here. This is the resource policy. Click on edit, and we'll add a statement here. You can give it any ID. We'll just keep the default statement 1. In principle, and this is where it's asking for the IAM user to which we want to add permission to. So I'm going to select right AWS, and in the double quotes, I'm going to open up the IAM window in a different tab so I can find the ARN for this user. And I'm going to go to users, click on my user, get the ARN from here, go back and paste it here. And then effectors allow, and then action, and they have a whole UI here from where you can pinpoint the action which you want to attach to the policy. So I'm going to select S3 for the action. I'll select get object, and it pops it up here. And then in the resource, I'm going to specify the exact object which I want to give access to. So I will have to open the S3 window again to find the name of the object. So go inside my bucket, to this object, and copy the ARN here. Come back and put this up here. So now my S3 bucket policy is ready. In summary, it's giving access to this particular user to get object, and the ARN of the resource is this. In our previous video, we already covered how to create an IAM policy. So I'm not going to do that again, but I will show you how the resource policy is different from an IAM policy. So the policy that I've already created in IAM, it's right here. And this policy is doing the exact same thing as the resource policy that we just created, right? It's giving access to a user to get object from an S3 bucket for a particular resource. Now, if you compare and contrast the IAM policy with the resource policy, maybe I can pull this up side by side for the comparison here. So now you can see here that the only real difference between an IAM policy and a bucket policy is that the bucket policy has a principal component attached to it. And that is common sense. Just by the nature of IAM policy, that is going to be attached to a particular user or a particular principal, it does not need to know the principal ARN. However, a bucket policy or resource policy is attached to a resource, and so it needs to identify the principal or the user group or role to which is going to give this permission to. So that's basically the only difference between a bucket policy and an IAM policy, is that the bucket policy, the resource policy, has a principal component, while the IAM policy does not have that. So let us now see if our create a resource policy actually works. So I'm going to click on Save Changes here, and you're going to come back to the bucket. If I go click on the bucket again, go to the permissions, we see that the policy is attached to it. And let's go back to the IAM menu, and let's just confirm if there are no other policies attached to that user, so that we can be sure that only the resource policy is giving permissions to this user. So this is user one, and if I come inside this, and we'll take a look at the permissions. There are no permissions attached to this user. So if you were only considering IAM to do your access reviews or your audits, you wouldn't be able to know if this user has any extra privileges. So now I'm going to create a security credential for this user in order to test if our resource policy permissions work. Go back to my terminal here to AWS configure. Copy the access key ID. I'm going to delete the access key ID later and confirm if our user is the correct user. And this is user one. I'm going to do AWS S3 CP. I'm going to copy the ARN of this user, or actually the S3 URI, and try to copy it to the current directory. So this works. And this means that our resource policy is working as expected. And even though our IAM console here does not show that there are any permissions for this user, but if we go to the bucket policy, we have the permissions attached here, and which is in fact giving permissions to this user to be able to get object from this bucket. So one other important thing that I want to show you here is that there are some resources in AWS like S3 objects or S3 bucket have web access URLs attached to them, meaning that these resources can be publicly exposed. So if I go to this bucket, click on this name, and click on this object itself, I see that there is S3 URI, there is an ARN, and then there's an object URL. Now this is a web access URL for this object. So if I open this up in the new window here, it tells me that this access is denied. And this is the default behavior in AWS where these web access URLs are disabled by default. However, if you are using resource policies, there is a way to disable this default behavior. That is, there's a way to publicly expose this particular S3 object. So let's take a look at the bucket policy that we created just a while back. So if you remember from our IAM policy discussion, we said that these resources here, these elements here, like principal, action, resource, they can all be assigned, instead of what we have here, they can be assigned a star. For example, I can put a star here. So what the star basically means is applicable to all, right? And in the case of this policy, this means that this is now available to any person over the internet, not just with an AWS account, but anything. And that is because of that web access URL that is attached to this particular resource. So what happens if I do this? Right. First of all, if I try to click save here, this is going to give me an error. And the reason for that is that since this thing is very sensitive and there has been a lot of high-profile breaches because of this, AWS have created a kind of fail-safe to protect against it. And that fail-safe is essentially a lock that prohibits you from publicly exposing things. And you can see that if I go back to permissions here, this is that lock here, right here. So I have to click on edit here, disable this lock, and save changes, confirm here, and that pretty much disables that lock. So I'll go back to permissions again, click on edit, and remove this block and put star. Now as I save it, clearly AWS gives me a warning saying this is publicly accessible now. And if I go back to my object, right click and open up this tab, the photo now opens up, or the object now opens up. So using this feature, which is very powerful, and if you do some kind of a misconfiguration, you use this policy, you can potentially make your objects publicly available to unauthorized parties. So be very careful when you are using resource policies. So this is it for the lab walkthrough. Keep watching out for more videos and articles at cloudsecuritymasterclass.com.